Well, David Congdon, welcome to Love, Rinse, Repeat, episode 50, 7 Last Words. We are talking about the last words from Matthew, well, not just Matthew, but and about 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani. That is, my God, why have you forsaken me? But jumping right in, what do you hear in these words?
Well, these words for me indicate the scandal of the gospel. They crystallize and encapsulate something that is deeply offensive and scandalous for most believers. This notion that God might be absent from us in our hour of need, in the most critical moment of our existence. This pivotal turning point of Jesus' history, his life, and perhaps we might say of our own. And I think there's a lot of literature surrounding this one phrase and how to incorporate it safely into our theologies. We want to find ways to sanitize it and make it innocuous for our faith. And that's often done by appealing to the psalm from which it's drawn, or appeals maybe to the doctrine of the Trinity and the security that this is all taken care of by the fact that it's one eternal being of God, and so we don't have to worry about this crisis of faith that we might say that Jesus is having in that moment. And I find those strategies to be offensive in a different way, because they lessen and divert us from hearing the scandal of that statement. And they find ways to make it safe for us. And I don't think it's supposed to be safe. I don't think this passage is meant to be easily and beautifully incorporated into our liturgies. It's meant to be an interruption and a disruption of ourselves, of our worship, of our theology, our practice, and our politics. So in that sense, I think that's what I hear in that statement is something deeply disturbing to Christian faith and theology.
Thank you. And I think what's interesting, I reckon there must be a link then, it's not obviously not a universal issue that the church faces, but a link then from a kind of trying to quickly absorb this statement into a neater theology or into a liturgy or into our piety. And, the struggle Christians sometimes face when talking with someone who is, in a moment of God forsakenness, of God abandonment, and struggling to kind of meet that person in that moment without trying to get to the end of the psalm and remind them where that ends. So I guess how does acknowledging that this is a disruption, an interruption, and a scandal in the first sense, help in the sense of those kind of interpersonal encounters that we often find ourselves in?
Yeah, the pastoral implications of this are, I would take it to be, it doesn't mean that there isn't comfort here, or that there isn't a word of hope or of grace, of presence even. But I do think it means that we have to rethink what that comfort looks like, what that presence of God looks like, not to be in competition with the absence and with the disruption. So to put it a certain way, God's presence is found precisely in this moment of absence. One of the problems I have with the reference to the psalm or to other theological strategies of dealing with this passage are that they presuppose that absence and presence are in competition with each other, that we have to, if God is absent, God can't be present. If God is present, God's no longer absent. And I think that's precisely what we don't find in Scripture, or we don't find in this passage in particular, but really throughout the narratives of the Gospels and Christian theology more generally, rooted in the incarnation. This notion of simultaneously divine and human, simultaneously, transcendent and immanent and historical. those kinds of paradoxes and simultaneities, the coincidence of opposites, I think are really important here. And this passage in some ways brings all that together, this paradox of God's presence being found in and through absence, or to put another way, the glory of the resurrection found in and through the suffering of the cross. That's another of those moments when we want to like make the resurrection a fix of the crucifixion, kind of a, the problem and answer. I don't think that's really what we find in Scripture, or what we find in our understanding of Christ. But what we see instead, I think, is that the resurrection comes in and through the cross, right? It's simultaneous with that event. The resurrection reveals to us what the crucifixion is all about, what it really is. And in this same sense here, God's absence in this moment clarifies for us what God's presence actually is. God's presence everywhere is is an invisible presence, a presence that is not something that we can grasp hold of and say, God is here, secure as my possession. What this moment of my God, why have you forsaken me kind of unveils for us is that we don't ever have the grasp, a hold of God. We don't ever have possession of God. And so in that sense, we can take comfort in the fact that those moments of abandonment that we experience, those moments of feeling like we are truly, utterly alone, we are most fully identified in those moments with Jesus, where we are most fully in that place of that experience that He shared in, and we can have the knowledge and comfort that those moments are where we will most precisely find the presence of God. And so it's not going to be a presence that's going to wipe away any of our fears or dispel any of our anxieties and doubts, but that's precisely kind of what we need to discover in those moments, what that reveals for us. We don't need to run away from our fears. We don't need to try to escape our anxieties or our insecurities. God doesn't annihilate those or get rid of all those for us. Rather, God meets us precisely in those moments.
Thank you. I think then that also, like, not only meeting us in those moments, and not only a word that we don't have to flee from that or suppress that, but it's when we then encounter that in the other, when we encounter others in those states, either an existential personal crisis, or people who have been pushed out by the society and by the religious order. That too is where we're going to encounter God very fully and present.
Absolutely right. I mean, I definitely think there is there's a social dimension to this, in terms of it calls us to ally ourselves to those who are abandoned and maybe marginalized by the structures and the religious communities that are kind of guaranteeing presence and security. So and it definitely should hopefully awaken us to the needs of those around us who are experiencing those moments of uncertainty and doubt and absence in their life.
Thank you. So in the past, when we've talked, when you've been on Love, Rinse, Repeat, twice it was to talk about your book, The God Who Saves, right. And we're already been drawing material from this because, as you say, it's the God who saves. And so much of your book is centered on this moment of God forsakenness, of God abandonment, of being taken outside oneself in this moment. But that is, as you say, when you're talking before about hope and comfort, because that is the site of salvation. That is where salvation interrupts our lives individually. Each and every person is in those own moments where we have this experience. Can you talk a little bit about how, this line, this word from the cross, more so than maybe one we're going to get to soon, it is finished, is linked so well to the side of salvation?
Right. Well, I mean, so part of my larger project in that book is to develop what I call an apocalyptic account of salvation. And the reason why that passage is important to me, for a number of reasons, but it does seem, for me, it does indicate this apocalyptic nature of this cross event, this what's happening, and partly that's because the narratives of Matthew and Mark in particular kind of can disclose some of that. You have, well, the overall apocalyptic tone of Mark in general brings us to this climax of Mark 15 when that passage appears, and it does have this escalating and apocalyptic tone until this critical moment occurs, and so it serves a kind of narrative climax. Matthew makes it even more kind of poignant by adding that kind of a rather mysterious section, Matthew 27, following that cry, where you have the people being resurrected out of these tombs and walking around the streets of Jerusalem, and so you do have both of these texts kind of highlight this almost otherworldly, incomprehensible mystery of this event. And uh, what I want to do in my work is to highlight the way in which that should reveal something to us about what salvation is all about. It's not. A lot of people want to put the salvation to be later on. It's like these events are only about the person of Jesus, but they don't speak about anything about ourselves. They're unique to that story. I don't disclose anything about what salvation means for you and for me today. And I think that's too limited a scope for me, too narrow a vision of theology. I do think that these events do connect to each person, but in other ways. And the way I frame it in my work is to understand faith as this moment of identification with the crucified one, specifically identification with the one crucified in God abandonment. And so what that allows us to do, if we frame salvation in those terms, is both to kind of make better sense, I think, of the apocalyptic character of salvation more generally in theology, but specifically to recognize the way in which salvation is not this wholly comforting message of rescue out of our problems. One of the ongoing struggles I think there is with Christian preaching and pastoral ministry and really just theology more generally is this, what I was saying before, this opposition between absence and presence, between salvation and anxiety and fear and doubt, faith and doubt, that binary opposition that often leads people to think that if they do have doubts, they must not have genuine faith. If they do have anxiety, they must not have genuine confidence in God's power, God's love or grace. And that presents a whole host of other pastoral issues that need to be addressed theologically, and they begin from a problematic starting point. This presupposition that these things are opposed, mutually exclusive, and if there's one, then there's not the other. And so I want to get beyond that. I want to really think theologically beyond those binaries, and what that will be, it'll be a scandal for those who have taken a lot of comfort in those binaries, who have rested very securely in their knowledge of their election, their knowledge of their faith, their knowledge of God, and all those securities of knowledge and experience that people have invested so much of their energy into. So my theological approach will definitely call a lot of that into question. But I do hope that it will also be a word of comfort for those who have felt marginalized by those comforts and those securities, who have felt excluded from the community of the faithful because they've never been able to have that supreme, serene confidence in God's presence and power in their life. I want to give a word. I want to speak a word of grace and salvation, really, to those people. And I think that's where we see Jesus most present in the Gospels, and that's where I think we see Jesus most present today.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's really excellent. It's like I've always appreciated about your work in The God Who Saves It Otherwise is, you know, people might think when they first hear that, oh, you're diving in on this and you're blowing up these binaries, that it's just this like sledgehammer attack to everything people hold near and dear. But it is a work filled with grace and hope and encouragement to those probably who need it
I hope so.
desperately. Yeah. Now, another thing I was thinking about with this word from the cross, like the Bible is it's more like when they were writing the Bible and these letters and these gospels, it's more like Twitter than a blog, right? You've got to use your characters sparingly. You've only got so much parchment, you can only fit so much, and you know, you got to use it sparingly. So usually not a lot of extra detail, extraneous detail is put in. Yet we have it written out twice. We have it written in Aramaic and then would have been in Greek, but you know, and in you know, even in English translations, we keep one in this foreign tongue and then put one into the translated language, which obviously has to be a very deliberate choice. Now, you've kind of talked about this text as an interruption, as something that's very other, especially with what Matthew adds. You know, do you think that is part of it, or do you have any other thoughts on why it's been included twice in different languages?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I haven't actually pondered that much myself. I mean, I think you're right. It absolutely is a deliberate choice. My guess, if I had to put my historical critical hat on for a moment, it would be that it is there were received oral traditions handed on to the community of Jesus followers in that period, and they were used to maybe liturgically referring to that statement in Aramaic, and so perhaps it was important to keep that in there in that form as to indicate that liturgical historical tradition that had been passed on. So I think there's probably some oral tradition going on there. That's behind that. I mean, I certainly do think it also maybe gestures in the direction of the translatability of the gospel more generally. That's certainly been something that's been important to my work. The emphasis on the non-exclusive nature of this message that's not bound to a specific language or culture. But you know, I think that's a interesting, worthwhile thought. Question to ponder further. I'll have to give it more thought myself.
Yeah, I think we can offer that to people as something to, you know, tweet at us with your best ideas. But I think that translatability thing is interesting because you think about, like, so the psalm is written in Hebrew. Most people in that time probably reading it in Greek. Jesus says it in Aramaic, and now we read it in Aramaic, a language we've completely lost any kind of contact with, and in English. So it's like or in German or in Chinese or in
right, sure,
sorry, or whatever. You know, so that is an interesting thread to pull. So I guess the final question as we kind of land this plane is, I mean, we've already kind of been touching on it, but I guess, you know, part of the reason I'm doing this and putting this out there is, you know, there won't be Good Friday services in the way we are used to having them. Like, I mean, lots of churches are going online or doing written things, or, you know, lots of very good creative work has been done. But, you know, this is a moment of God abandonment on the cross, and a moment that many people are feeling abandoned and isolated and acutely alone. Do you have any thoughts to share as we kind of close out on this word from the cross in the time of COVID-19 and the time of isolation and distancing and the closure of churches and the disruption of our familiar routines in Holy Week and just in general?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that this passage is maybe uniquely appropriate for this moment. I mean, we're seeing this rapid increase in cases and deaths around the world right now, and it's certainly a moment of terror for a lot of folks, and deep stress and anxiety. This is in some ways, you know, a "why have you forsaken me" moment for many people, and I was reminded as I participated in a Zoom church this past week that uh, it one of the things that I've always it's been important to me in thinking through what it means to be a Christian, what it means to have Christian faith, and what that entails, is the importance of distinguishing between the reality of faith, the genuineness of faith, and participation in a corporate body of worship. That's been important for me because I haven't always felt very connected to a church, to any community that, I've been a part of various churches over the years, and it's been a kind of a love-hate relationship on my part. I think it's true for many people, and that doesn't mean I disregard it or don't think it's important. But I do think that this whole experience is helping us to embrace and discover in new ways the invisibility of the church, which is something that often gets short shrift nowadays in theology. But there's something about that doctrine and that idea that is important. It's been important to me for a long time, and I think it's important for theology more generally. And it's to remember that the church isn't confined to the physical spaces and locations that we have erected as kind of those visible markers of the community. As important as those may be, as valuable as our liturgies and our practices often are, the Spirit of God is not bound to them and is not confined to the locations that we've marked out to encounter that Spirit. And I do hope that people are maybe embracing and discovering new ways of encountering God. I recall Wendell Berry, who spent a decade plus going to church in the woods to write poetry on his own, and that for him was a deeply rejuvenating and spiritual experience for a long time. His kind of estrangement from the church, and I think that in some ways is a practice that we could live into in these moments. Writing poetry in the woods or wherever one might be what it means to participate in that invisible church that unites and binds us all. So that's been my time right now. That's certainly been my experience, and I hope that's true for other people as well. But yeah, the Spirit of God is still moving and active in ways that are not confined by our ecclesiastical structures and institutions. And that's an important thing that we need to continually be reminded about.
Thank you. What a wonderful place to end. If you have enjoyed some of the things David's been saying, you can read about them in much more detail and with much more implications for the whole breadth of theology in The God Who Saves, a dogmatic sketch. You have a few other books, especially if you're interested in Rudolf Bultmann. You can check out David's books on that. You're at DW Congdon on Twitter.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. Anything else you want to draw people's attention to at this moment?
That's about it. No, thank you very much, Liam. Appreciate it.
Great. Thank you for joining us today. And another word is about to start.